What's up, everybody? And welcome back to another week. Hope everybody had a wonderful weekend. We had one of the more important witnesses today in this Rust shooting case, in my opinion, and someone that's going to be even more important in the Alec Baldwin trial if and when we get there. So we're going to dive deep into his testimony. We're going to listen to some of his direct, some of his cross. We're also going to get into the witness we finished with Friday and then the very quick witness today, just to talk about the prosecution checking some boxes they feel like they need to check for this jury, answering questions the jury may have. I appreciate everybody joining me. It's going to be a moving target here, trying to fit these videos into the lunch break, as the court does not always break at noon their time, which would be 2 p.m. my time. It is ever changing. So make sure you subscribe to our channel if you guys haven't already, and make sure you hit that reminder bell so you will be getting alerted every time if we change the time, if we move it up like we did today from 2 to 1:45, so that we could get as much of it into the lunch break as we could and get you guys back out to wherever you're watching the full stream of the trial. But I wanted to answer the questions you guys have for me, give my perspective on how the state will use certain witnesses and how the defense may attack certain witnesses, especially when we start to get into the experts. So hit that like button if you guys haven't already as we jump into last Friday afternoon. It was a quick afternoon. We heard from Miss Walters, who was a member of the crew. She was a unit production manager, and the state wanted to basically impeach some of the things the defense said about Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, whether or not she wanted to train with Baldwin. According to this witness, she never knew that Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was trying to train with Baldwin or anybody else. They're trying to, and again, it's kind of the Jennifer Crumbly thing, where they tried to make her seem like a hyper-vigilant parent, and I think it backfired. I think the defense has to be careful about saying Ms. Gutierrez was so careful and wanted to train people and wanted to do things right, because I think that could backfire for them as well. And they impeached some of that, the state did, with this witness. She talked about how Sarah Zachary and Hannah Gutierrez were the only ones that had keys to the prop truck, and that the defendant definitely took stuff out of the prop truck prior to the search warrant. Then on cross, the defense jumps in and says other people absolutely took stuff from the prop truck. The LEO, law enforcement, cleared the scene. Talked about people being disgruntled and walking off set, but that nobody complained about the defendant. Nobody complained about Hannah Gutierrez. And Ms. Walters confirmed that. She was asking if Baldwin ever looked like he wasn't paying attention in training or didn't really care. Basically, she kind of confirmed that it seemed like he wasn't paying attention sometimes. But then on redirect, good job by the state to come say, that's fine. Other people took stuff off the prop truck. But between October 21st, which is the day of the incident, and October 27th, only Ms. Gutierrez took things from the prop truck, which I thought was very interesting. And the defense or the state comes back also on redirect and says, I have a question. You said nobody complained about the defendant, right? But they did complain about the accidental discharges on set. And she basically impeached her own witness, the state did, to get over the fact that it was ammunition, it was weapons, it was what Hannah Gutierrez was supposed to be in charge of that the crew complained about and walked off set. So I thought that was a good job by the state of bringing that back around with this witness. And then this morning we started out with the FBI agent, Mr. Ziggler, I believe is his name. He's a weapons and firearm expert. And we finally get to an explanation of what this gun is, what he tested, why it broke, why it started not working. How do we know if Alec Baldwin pulled the trigger? Well, this is that expert. He is going to explain that to us. And it's really interesting to me that they brought this much out during this trial, because I'm not sure how necessary a lot of this testing was to the Hannah Gutierrez trial as much as it was to Alec Baldwin. But we're also going to see how the defense attacks that. Are they going to jump on board and say, that's right, Alec Baldwin had to pull the trigger, it's his fault? Because where Hannah Gutierrez is in that chain of events could still give her criminal culpability. So once again, as they've had to do throughout this trial, is they have to toe the line. So let's jump in here and take a listen to some of Mr. Ziggler's testimony about this gun, about the testing, about how we know what we know, and whether or not you think the state using him is proving these points beyond reasonable doubt enough that a jury will rule in their favor.
Mr. Ziggler, tell us a little bit about this firearm that was provided to you. What kind of a gun is it? And just generally speaking, how does a gun like this operate?
So this is an image, a photograph of the revolver that was submitted. And this is a single action revolver. So that means that the hammer must be manually cocked by the shooter every time that the shooter intends to fire. So some revolvers, if you pull the trigger, it will do the work of cocking the hammer for you and releasing the hammer. This type of firearm does not have that ability. The shooter must physically cock the hammer each time. Is this a touchscreen by chance? Okay. So to point out a few key areas of this firearm, the portion on the left, don't believe him.
He's going to come help you.
Okay. Thank you. So the portion on the left in this photograph is the barrel. Towards the center, we have the cylinder. This back portion here is the hammer. We have the trigger near the bottom, and this wooden piece is the grip. So this is where you would hold the firearm.
And while this may seem, basic and elementary level to some of you that have experience with this, as a lawyer and using your expert, you have to break it down. We talk about using verbiage the jury can understand. We need to make sure that we explain where every single thing is. So if we're going to reference the hammer or the trigger or the handle or the barrel or the cylinder, everybody's on the same page as to what we were talking to. So I thought it was a good way to kind of work their way into the testimony about this firearm.
Clear this out. So basically, in order to get this firearm to function, you would have to load cartridges into the cylinder. This can be accomplished two ways. You can't see it in this photograph, but on the opposite side is what's called a loading gate. You can open and you then have access to the cylinder. So you can load each cartridge one at a time, rotating the cylinder until you have as many cartridges as you desire. You could also remove this pin here, remove the cylinder from the firearm, and load it that way. But regardless, once you load the cylinder, you must manually cock the hammer all the way to the rear, and then at this point, this firearm will be ready to fire. So a pull of the trigger would release the firearm, or excuse me, the hammer. The hammer has a firing pin that's fixed to the hammer. So as the hammer falls, the firing pin would strike the primer of the cartridge and fire that cartridge.
Can you give us a quick description about the notches on the hammer and the different hammer positions?
Yeah, so as you would cock this hammer.
And what's interesting about, as he's going to talk about the different spots to put the hammer, we can remember back and think to the Alec Baldwin interview. That's going to come out during Alec Baldwin's case. Not necessarily here, but in Alec Baldwin's case, he references where he put the hammer back when it went off without him pulling the trigger, according to him.
It has several safety notches by design. So as you cock it, you're going to hear a series of clicks, and those are the safety notches. So as you start to cock it, you're going to hear your first click. That's the quarter cock notch. If you continue to cock it, you'll hear your second click. That's the half cock notch. And if you cock it all the way, you'll hear the third click, and that's when it's in its fully cocked position. So those intermediate two cocking positions, they serve to do two things. Number one, when the hammer is completely at rest or not cocked at all, the firing pin actually protrudes inside the frame. So it's very difficult to see here, but in between this gap, between the cylinder and the frame, you would actually be able to see the firing pin sticking out. So as you start to cock it, it starts to remove the firing pin from protruding. So we don't want the firing pin making contact with the cartridges when we don't want it to. So it starts to retract the firing pin. And also, if I'm cocking the hammer and my thumb slips off the hammer, you would expect that it's going to catch in one of those two safety notches. So this is to prevent the hammer from falling unless you want it to. So really, this firearm is only designed to fire when the hammer is in its fully cocked position.
In terms of the, well, let me ask
It's
you
only
this.
designed to fire that way, but is that the only way it can fire? There are certain things he said that I do think leave open to interpretation, and there's some things the defense can pick out here with this witness.
The half cock notch. So that's going to be the second click that you hear when you're cocking the hammer. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is there anything particular about the half cock position other than it being a safety?
Can you elaborate?
Sure. What position does the hammer have to be in order to load this gun with ammunition?
I understand. So you have to have the hammer retracted to a certain point to allow the cylinder to rotate freely. So there's a part, and it's on the inside here, called the cylinder stop, and that cylinder stop does not unlock until the hammer is pulled back to a certain point. So once it's pulled back to a certain degree, you can freely rotate the cylinder to load it with as many cartridges as you desire.
So in order to load and unload this gun, if you don't remove the pin and remove the cylinder, it has to be in the half cock position.
I'm not sure if it's somewhere between the quarter and the half cock, but it is in that intermediate area, yes.
So once you get it into the half cock position, what do you have to do to load it?
So I'll clear this out. Again, on the other side, there's a loading gate that you can open, and you then have access to the cylinder, so you can load it that way or remove the cylinder itself.
How many cylinder positions do you have access to when you open that loading gate?
Only one at a time, so you must manually rotate the cylinder and continue to load a single cartridge at a time.
So for those of us that are familiar with revolvers where you push a button and the entire cylinder kind of rolls out and you can load and unload that way, does this gun work that way?
No, those are going to be your more
She
modern
shook her
style
head.
revolvers.
She's like, does this gun work that way? As she shakes her head.
If you noticed, when you received this gun and you examined this gun, did this gun appear to be very old or relatively new, or were you not able to tell?
I'm not able to tell its age now.
Um,
She wanted him to say it was a new gun because that's what they said in the opening, that it wasn't an old gun, even though it looks like an old gun. But he said, I didn't know the age of the gun.
who is the manufacturer of this revolver?
The trade name is Pieta. It's an Italian company.
And do you know anything about Pieta and what they do, what they make?
I do know they have product lines they create new firearms that are essentially replicas of older firearms.
Is this a replica?
It's a replica in that it's an old design, but it's still a functioning firearm.
Now, if the hammer, let's talk about kind of hypothetically, let's assume that this gun is fully loaded with live ammunition, and we have the hammer in its resting position, so it's fully down. Is that the position it's in this photo?
Yes, it appears so.
So how is this gun designed in terms of safety with regard to possible accidental discharges when the hammer is in the fully rested position?
Right. So when the hammer is fully forward, as I mentioned earlier, the firing pin actually protrudes inside the frame. So if you have the cylinder fully loaded and the hammer is at rest on a chamber that has a live cartridge in it, that firing pin is actually sitting on the primer of that cartridge. So if I were either to strike the hammer or if I were to drop it and it landed on the hammer, it's going to fire that cartridge. So if you hit the hammer with enough force, it will detonate that primer in that position. And that's part of the design of this firearm. That's just how these are made. And if you were to look at the owner's manual, which this is one thing I did as part of my exam, you would actually see warnings not to carry this firearm with a hammer at rest on a loaded chamber. So a lot of times it's actually advised that you load one less cartridge in the cylinder, so you have one empty chamber, and that's how it's carried with the hammer forward on that chamber.
And they were talking about whether or not one of the cylinders was empty, but it's interesting. So that brings in another element, right? Was he just resting his thumb? Was it in the no cocked position or whatever, the resting position where it's up against the firing pin because he did not believe the ammunition was live? It was called cold gun. So we know what Baldwin says, that he pulled it back, whatever he says he did with the hammer, but did not pull the trigger. There are other elements and other ways coming in that it could have been in the resting position, which, he thinks there's nothing wrong with that. If it's a dummy round or if it's a blank or whatever, then it shouldn't be a problem. So I think he's adding more gray area and more confusion and more ways that this could have gone off without him pulling the trigger, which is why most of the verbiage being used is manipulated the handgun in a way that caused it to go off, is the language that everybody's been using. So I think it's very interesting to hear him describe this. And it's not like the only way that a bullet ever exits the barrel, but for pulling the trigger. That's not what I'm hearing with this expert. Now, he kind of says something to that effect later when the hammer's in different positions, but very interesting and a lot of fodder for defense attorneys to work with.
So these are recommendations in the owner's manual. So this isn't some phenomenon. This is something that's known about the design of these firearms.
And what kind of testing did you perform on this firearm?
So initially I did a function evaluation just to make sure it appeared that, there weren't any odd modifications, that it was functioning correctly. After that, I was requested to do some microscopic comparisons, as I was also submitted a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case. And then the last type of testing I did on this particular gun is what's called accidental discharge testing. So essentially the goal of that test is to see if I can get this firearm to function without pulling the trigger.
So the first set.
What's interesting is he already talked about one way he could, right? It doesn't seem like he did that or tested that, but based on the owner's manual, we've already heard one way that could happen. But he also did other testing to see, is there any other way that if I manipulate it in a certain way, I could fire this weapon without pulling the trigger?
Testing that you mentioned, what did that entail?
So function examination is basically, I need to inspect the firearm for safety purposes. Keep in mind, I've never seen this firearm before when I first opened the box. So I don't know what condition it's been in. I don't know how old it is. I don't know how well it's been taken care of. So eventually I'm going to want to test fire that gun. So I need to make sure I feel that it's safe to fire, so I don't have some catastrophic failure while I do so. Once I determine that it is safe to fire, I will physically take the gun to one of two locations in the FBI lab, and I will load it with ammunition from the laboratory and actually test fire the gun.
And did you test fire this gun?
Yes, I did.
Approximately how many rounds of ammunition did you fire out of this gun?
May I refer to my report?
Sure.
I physically fired this gun 12 times. So as a result of that, I retained the fired bullet and fired cartridge cases that I produced during that test firing.
So he fired it 12 times. Okay. Some may think that's a lot, some may not. I think that's why the prosecutor looked at the jury to see if they thought it was a lot or not. There's a reason it was only 12 times, and he kept everything and all the data from those 12 shots. But it's about to get interesting here.
And I also collected some other cartridge cases as a product of the testing that I did. So these would be cartridge cases that I collected during the accidental discharge testing.
And the rounds that you fired, the 12 rounds that you fired out of this gun, were they evidence rounds or were those rounds that were supplied by the FBI?
They were FBI cartridges, and then once I fire them in the evidence firearm, they become what's called secondary evidence. And essentially, if I have to conduct microscopic comparisons at a later point, that secondary evidence, they now become my knowns. I know they came from that firearm because I physically shot it and collected those items.
All right, thank you. Tell us about the second group of testing that you did.
Right, that was the microscopic comparisons. So again, I was submitted a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case. And essentially I was asked to determine if, in my opinion, I could determine if those two items were fired by this particular revolver.
Okay, and let me back you up for a moment. Did you examine rounds of ammunition as a part of your forensic examination in this case?
Yes, I did.
And did you examine dummy rounds?
Yes, I did.
Did you examine live rounds?
Yes.
Did you examine live rounds? Well, did you examine live rounds that you understood to be provided by someone named Seth Kinney?
Yes, there were some cartridges that were submitted and they were declared to be live rounds as they were submitted.
Did you examine live ammunition that came from a location that you were notified was 126 Monroe Street?
I don't object to leading.
I'm not leading. I'm just asking him a direct question.
May I review my?
Sure.
Basically, what they're going to get into as well is where did the lethal bullet come from? He can confirm that it came from the gun in question. Kinney's ammo was very different than the ammo that was on set. Confirm that some of the ammo on set was live, even though he didn't test every single one of them. So they do get through some of the ammunition questions. But what I really want to get to is the gun breaking during his testing, because that's a huge deal to defense attorneys.
Of the movie Rust.
Yes, I did.
And when you examined that ammunition, what did that entail?
So the evaluation of the ammunition kind of took place in a couple different phases. So first, I just looked at the physical characteristics. So I evaluated its appearance from the outside. And based on that, I started to segregate these types of ammunition into groups just based on their physical appearance. So I could put them into groups. For example, some of them appeared to be live cartridges. So I had that group. Some of them appeared to be dummy rounds. And so they may have some physical visual clue that they may be a dummy. So for instance, some of them had holes drilled into the side of them. So I could look into the cartridge and see there was no powder present. Some of them, when you shake them,
now, it is good when witnesses are repeating what you've already said in opening statement and asked other witnesses about the holes being in the side, shaking them, and you can hear the BBs moving around. And he's explaining how you can tell the difference between live and dummy ammo. On cross, though, the defense brings up a good point. Kind of the first thing they said was, you're not an expert in dummy versus live rounds. And he says, well, I think I do have training in it. But then he asks him about some, dummy round from some other country. He's like, yeah, I don't necessarily know about that. He also talks about how you can't just look at every round and know whether or not it's live. And he talks about 100 times, and we'll probably hear him in the portion that I'm going to play, about how he's got to take it apart and see the four components. The defense uses his own words against him to say, you take it apart, you look at those four components. That's how you know it's live, not just because it's a certain color or has a certain color cylinder in the back. And the expert agrees with him. So some of the ways the state was trying to simplify it that I liked, that if I was a juror, I'd be like, okay, that simplifies it. It's not rocket science. Well, this guy makes it seem a little more complex than that. And I think the defense did a good job pointing that out on cross.
Actual BBs inside. So that produces an audible indicator that even though this looks to be a live cartridge, in reality, there's nothing on the inside. So I can shake it, and that's another indicator that may be a dummy. There were a series of blanks, which a blank does not have a bullet. It still has a primer and gas, but it's not meant to actually fire a projectile. So I started to form these groups just based on their physical characteristics. I then x-rayed all the ammunition because I could hear some of these cartridges it sounded like BBs inside when you shook them. So I wanted to get an idea of just a picture of what was going on inside these cartridges.
And the defense was like, well, you didn't test every single one. And the state's like, if you would have tested every single one, how long would that would have taken? He said there was like hundreds of them, but he did x-ray them all. And by x-raying them all, he could confirm they had indicators of dummy cartridges with holes in the side or BBs in different ways. So he did actually look into every single one. So the defense was trying to poke a hole that I think the state filled pretty good.
So again, I took those two pieces of information, sorted them into groups, and then eventually I worked with the contributor to determine which of these cartridges actually need to be disassembled. So we can take out the bullet and we can look inside and see, is there any powder present? Does it look like the primer is active or not? So those were kind of the 3 phases to sort of determine which categories these cartridges actually fell into.
Okay, and quickly, I'm going to jump you to the accidental discharge testing that you did. Can you summarize for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that accidental discharge testing consisted of and why you did that testing?
Right. So again, accidental discharge, its goal is essentially to determine, can I fire this firearm without pulling the trigger?
That's going to be the ultimate question in Alec Baldwin's case. Not necessarily the ultimate question here, but whether or not he pulled the trigger doesn't win or lose the case for Hannah. I think it could help, but still, I think the big question for her is, how did live rounds get on the set? How did rounds get in the firearm? And how was it called cold gun, if it was? So those are her big questions. But still, this is really interesting to me. And this is kind of what I've really been waiting to hear. I assumed they were going to testify just like this, but how effective was it when we actually saw it happen in court?
That's kind of the end goal. And the way we do that is the test is designed to simulate the firearm being bumped or banged into something, just being jostled around, and seeing, can those kind of interactions fire the firearm? So the way we replicate this in the laboratory is I will take the gun and actually strike it with a rawhide mallet on 6 planes. So if you picture a box sitting in front of you, the 6 planes would be the front of the box, the rear of the box, the left side, the right side, the top, and the bottom. So those are the 6 planes. So if you kind of picture the revolver and picture how those 6 planes work around that gun, I'm going to go around and strike the firearm in all 6 of those planes with a rawhide mallet. Again, trying to determine if it will actually fire without me touching the trigger.
And specifically, when you're striking the firearm, are you striking the hammer?
That was a part of the testing that I did, yes.
Prior to conducting
that
testing,
he did strike the hammer. What's interesting to me is he says in the manual in the beginning that if you strike the hammer, it will go off. Now he's saying he strikes the hammer. But again, because of the vagaries, it's hard to tell if he struck it when it was in the resting position in the scenario that he said it could fire in the past. So it's really interesting to try to follow exactly what tests he did, and which is why it's very important to be specific as an attorney asking these questions.
Did you have any thoughts about whether that could potentially result in damage to the gun?
Right. So this is actually in our standard operating procedures, that this type of testing is potentially destructive to the firearm. So just kind of generally speaking, if I'm going to do an exam that may destroy or alter the evidence permanently, I would seek out the contributor's permission to do that exam before I actually go and do it. So that is what was done in this case.
So they know it's going to be a big question that he destroyed the weapon and made it unusable and untestable for anybody else. So he let them know that before he did this testing. That's not going to stop the defense from saying, you don't know what it was like before. You don't know if your hammer actually was the one doing the breaking. And we'll get into those questions later with the defense. And I thought it was a pretty good line of questioning, even though I do think this guy does a good job and he gives them the information that they need. Bodhi said she liked how scientifically he spoke. Sometimes I like that. Sometimes I don't. I like experts to dumb it down as much as possible, but you of course want them to be authoritative and the jury to hear them be like, oh, they obviously know what they're talking about because of the way that they speak. And sometimes it's the lawyer's job to make it more easily understandable. I hate the word dumb it down, but I use it sometimes. So to dumb it down or whatever, to even where the lawyers can understand it, somebody else's expertise. And of course, everybody else in the courtroom, including the jury.
So you obtained permission to proceed with that testing?
That's correct.
Understanding that it could result in damage?
Yes.
All right. Let's go ahead and, let's go ahead and just briefly describe the striking of the mallet and whether or not at some point there was damage and kind of what you learned during that test.
So as we're doing this test, we want to test the firearm in all modes of fire that it's capable of. So if I have a rifle, for instance, say it's semi-automatic and fully automatic, I would do the test in both of those settings. In this case, completely different type of firearm, but I wanted to test this gun in all 4 positions of the hammer. So at rest, quarter cocked, half cocked, and fully cocked. And essentially as a result of that testing, there were only 2 times that I was able to get this firearm to fire. The first one being when the hammer was at rest on a loaded chamber. So as I previously described to you.
Okay, I must have missed this when I was listening to it the first time. Okay, so he did say that hitting it like that does make it go off. Okay, so that was the first time.
Firing pin was sitting directly on the primer. So when I struck the hammer with a mallet, that provided enough force to detonate the primer.
Okay.
So again, that's a known feature of this type of firearm. The second test where this occurred was when the hammer was in the fully cocked position, and I was doing my striking in the 6 planes as I described. And eventually I got to the rear of the firearm, so that back plane. And eventually at some point I struck the hammer with a rawhide mallet, and the hammer actually fell and it detonated the primer. So what happened was some of the internal components of the firearm actually broke to allow that hammer to fall and fire the primed cartridge case.
So from looking at the outside, okay, from looking at the outside, that's the only way that he could know or not know whether the internal components are broken. But he's saying because he fired it and did all this testing before doing the hammer destructive testing, it never happened. But while doing the destructive testing, it did happen, which Alec Baldwin said, it was cocked back. But it must be because it was broken inside. So then he took it apart and noticed or found that there were components broken inside. Exactly what he expected. The question is, how do you prove that those components were not broken when Alec Baldwin was holding the gun? He's going to give you some reasons and give you some answers. And again, that's not necessarily the question in this case. But applying this testimony to Alec Baldwin's case, Tom said he's going to have to give the same testimony. I think his testimony is going to be expanded. I think he's going to be on the stand a lot longer in Alec Baldwin's case. And I think Alec Baldwin's lawyers are going to have a heyday with him on cross because they kind of gloss over it here. And we're going to hear that. But how do you know that nothing was wrong internally with that gun when Alec Baldwin had it? Just because it worked a few times, 12 times is all you fired it. Really interesting to me. This is a really interesting part of this case that a good defense attorney, I think, if you want my opinion, this is one of the reasons. The destructive testing, the firearm being broken now during testing, this testimony is one of the reasons they dropped the charges originally with Alec Baldwin. I think they're more confident in it now, but I do think it's tough. It's tough.
So I previously mentioned those quarter and half cock notches. If the hammer were to fall and there was no damage inside the gun, I would expect that the portion that makes contact with the hammer is called the sear. That sear should have been caught either by the quarter or the half cock notch as the hammer was falling. It should not have been able to fall all the way. So this is what led me to believe that there was some type of damage that occurred within the gun. And eventually I disassembled it to figure out exactly what that damage was.
So the damage that you discovered, just so we're clear, was that damage sustained at the FBI lab?
Yes, it was.
Based on the testing that you did, when this gun was received by the FBI, was it in proper working order?
Yes, so the first exam I did was the function exam. So again, that's making sure it's operating correctly and that it hasn't been modified. During that test, I also examined the safeties. So as it was received in that condition, when I went through the function.
But the functioning exam, are you messing with it in a way that could cause the hammer to go from the fully cocked position to hitting the primer by messing with it and doing things to see if that would happen? Or did you just use it like a normal gun, cock it and fire, or whatever it did for the functionality test? You have to dig into that as a defense attorney. Now, again, might not be the ultimate question in this case, but how many times did he mess with it to show that it wasn't broken or it wasn't starting to break to where 1 out of every 20 times? That's a question I would ask. So you're not sure that this thing would have broken and screwed up 1 out of 20 times, right? Because you only fired it 12 times. Do you have any idea how many times it was cocked on the set as part of the movie or part of the acting or making it look real? Do you have any idea how many times it was? Those are the kinds of questions you do have to ask to show that did he do enough testing to prove that it was not broken before he proved it was broken? Hopefully that wasn't too confusing.
Function evaluation, everything appeared to be operating correctly. So it functioned normally as it was designed.
So you were able to make it fire in the resting position, correct?
That's correct.
And then did you put it in the quarter cock position?
Yes.
And did you strike it with a mallet?
In that particular case, for the quarter as well as the half cock, I did not need to do the mallet testing.
What kind of testing did you do?
So the quarter and half cock notches are not designed to essentially lock the trigger or put your firearm completely in a safe setting. So again, they're designed that if your finger slips off the hammer, it's going to catch it. So in this type of gun, if your hammer is in either the quarter or the half cock, you can actually squeeze the trigger. And if you squeeze it hard enough, it's going to cock the hammer enough that it releases. So you can still make the hammer fall, even though it's in these two intermediate safety positions, if you apply sufficient pressure to the trigger. So I did a variety of testing to determine if I put the hammer in the quarter cock as well as the half cock notch, and I squeeze the trigger hard enough that I allow the hammer to fall, is it even feasible for the hammer to detonate the cartridge? And I determined in both of those positions it was not.
And we understand that the next testing that you did was in the full cock position.
That's correct.
And ultimately, as you predicted, was the gun damaged?
As a result of the testing, yes, it was damaged.
Okay. Let's move to State's Exhibit 97A. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, yeah,
so here is where we're looking at the parts, the internal parts, so we can see what's broken. And he'll explain how he knows what was broken, how it affected, why it was able to go off, things like that. I want to answer a couple questions though. Francis said the man broke the first gun he ever tested on a real case. Not sure. I am giving him a ton of credit. I'm not sure it was the first gun he ever tested, but he did say there were certain things that this was the first time he ever did. I think it was the drop test or something that he's done, or maybe it was the destructive testing that he had done. I think he has done other functional testing and things like that in cases. But yeah, I mean, breaking the weapon, even though it is part of it and it is something that happens from time to time in cases, it's never good. It's always something that the defense is going to push on. Lee, if it was damaged when Alec Baldwin had it, why did it work at all if it was damaged? So damage doesn't mean it doesn't fire, right? Sometimes with a weapon, damage means it could fire when you don't want it to. So the word worked, I think, is the word we have to figure out how we're going to define. Samantha, I think she's looking at 18 months, if I remember correctly. I don't know what the tampering charges are because I didn't look into that. Donald, Peter, why do the rules of firearm handling 101 go out the door for actors? I would trust nobody to hand me a firearm without checking it first. I don't think it goes out the door. And I think that's a lot of what Alec Baldwin's case is going to be about. And they even asked him, like, you never point the weapon at somebody unless you want to shoot it. It's the first rule that you have. So they do talk about that on cross with this witness as well. Melissa, you plus the stash look like Jack Pearson from This Is Us. Last time I had the stash, a lot of people said the same thing. I do understand this one. I do get this one. And thank you, Netwoman, for gifting some memberships. And Azam, I saw gifted a membership earlier. Thank you, everybody.
This piece is called the cylinder stop. So you can see a piece of that component fractured off. The bottom left here, we have the trigger. And this tiny piece here is what actually fractured off the trigger. Now, as I mentioned before,
it's a lot of broken pieces, right? If I'm Baldwin, I put this up there with all these arrows. I'm like, so this is broken, and this is broken, and this is broken, and this is broken. How many times did you hit it with the hammer? And it broke in all these places, and you don't think any of these things were broken before? But you don't know that because you couldn't see inside the gun before, right? Couldn't you have firing it 12 times, had lodged something that was already kind of broken back in place, then back out of place with one of these? I mean, you can ask a million questions to talk about all the things that could have gone wrong when Alec Baldwin was holding the weapon versus just that we know it broke during the destructive testing.
I explained the quarter and half cock notches, so I'm actually going to point those out to you. On the hammer, these kind of jagged edges, the first one is the quarter cock notch. So as you're cocking the hammer, you hear that first click. That is the sear portion of the trigger, which is now broken, locking into that little recess. Your second click is the half cock notch. So that's that second jagged edge. And then your last click is the actual sear notch. So that's where the trigger is sitting when the hammer is in its fully cocked position. So when I struck the hammer with the mallet, it actually broke off that piece of the trigger that was sitting up against the hammer there.
And is there anything unusual to you in this photo about the full cock notch on the hammer?
So again, this notch here is the full cock notch. So you may notice when looking at this that this notch appears much flatter when you compare it to the other two notches. So it could be that a small portion of this surface was also damaged during the testing. But in addition to that, there are times where the sear notch is just not as pronounced as the other two notches. So I didn't observe any damage myself in this particular area, but it's possible that that area was damaged as well.
And based on your testing, did you form an opinion about whether or not this gun could be fired without the handler pulling the trigger?
So again, the only two times that occurred was with the hammer at rest on a loaded chamber. And
she has to ask him this question like 4 times because he doesn't answer it the way that she wants to, but she wants him to say, no, you've got to pull the trigger basically.
I attributed this to the breakage of internal components. So again, if these parts had not broken, I would expect that the trigger should have been caught by either the quarter or the half cock notch as the hammer was coming forward. So I would not expect this to occur had this breakage not happened.
So just to be clear, did you form an opinion about whether the handler would have to pull the trigger of the gun to make the gun fire?
My opinion is that the only reason this occurred is because of the breakage. So in order to move the trigger away from the hammer, that's typically accomplished by
I think this adds his credibility that he doesn't just say yes, because some witnesses would just say yes.
Pulling the trigger. So in this case, the only way that was possible is because the trigger actually fractured.
Okay. So in order for you, just so that we're clear, in order for you to make the gun fire without pulling the trigger, when it was in the full cock position, you had to break it.
That's what I had to do in my lab. I can't account for all the other possibilities that may have existed in some hypothetical scenario, but this is the result as I tested in my laboratory. It would not
like hypothetically what it was like before you opened it up, because you actually don't know that.
Fire without pulling the trigger in the full cock setting without being broken.
Thank you. Let's move to State's Exhibit 98. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is a photograph of the fired bullet that was submitted for.
All right, so I'm going to pause here. We're not going to go through all the ammo as well. John says possibilities. I don't like maybes. John, in criminal cases, maybes are the worst thing you can get. So you're right. I don't like maybes either. Mo said, why would she be charged with 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter if there's only 1 manslaughter victim? It's like civil, basically it's a lower level negligence and a higher level negligence with a firearm. It just takes simple negligence. So there are 2, it's almost like alternative theories. I broke it down at length at another video in the playlist. Unfortunately, I do want to get to his cross here, so I'm going to try to jump into that. Lisa, thank you for gifting 5 memberships. Let me see here. All right, let's listen to some of the cross-examination because I think it was pretty good and they do make some points, but they don't go full bore like I think Baldwin's team would be on this specific witness.
Barrel cracks in the frame, things that I may think may lead to a catastrophic failure during the testing.
Okay, sir, do you take your test firing protocols? I'm sure you observe all those safety.
Here we go. Yeah.
So you wouldn't know what a Denix round is, would you?
I do not.
Okay. And you wouldn't know a Denix round is from Spain and it doesn't shake and it's a dummy round. You're not aware of that?
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, this is where he's just trying to prove he's not as much of a dummy, not as much of a live versus dummy versus blank round expert as he portrayed himself to be. Thank you, Carter, for gifting 5 memberships.
Now, also with respect to your training, you were trained in gun safety, correct?
Yes, sir.
And as an FBI agent, you're trained in gun safety, including don't point a weapon at anybody?
I'm not an agent, but because I fire as part of my job, I have been trained in safety precautions. Yes.
Okay, sir, and as part of your test firing protocols,
I may have called him an agent in the beginning, but I guess he's not an agent. But see, they are talking about this, right? They're definitely talking about don't point a gun, don't do this. Where was Alec Baldwin negligent? They want to point that out. The problem is for Hannah Gutierrez, Alec Baldwin could be negligent and at fault at the same time as her, right? So that's kind of their issue. Baldwin's going to point the finger fully at Hannah Gutierrez, but for her, sometimes I feel like, when they bury Baldwin, she's in the grave with him. So it's tough.
I'm sure you observe all those safety. Not to point a gun at anybody, treat it as loaded, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. You observe all those.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And sir, you indicated one of your opinions was that your first testing, you determined this gun functioned normally.
That's correct.
Okay. When you were doing that functionality test on the revolver you received, what types of things did you look at on the firearm?
So first I would inspect things like, are there bulges in the barrel, cracks in the frame, things that I may think may lead to a catastrophic failure during the testing.
Okay.
But when we looked at those broken pieces, with that answer, I would put that picture back of the broken pieces saying, I don't see a barrel here. I don't see a cylinder here. I don't see any cracks in the frame. Do you? That's not what caused this catastrophic failure, but you couldn't see any of these parts when you did your testing at first and inspected the gun before the functional testing, right? Because he didn't mention the inside because you can't see it.
Sir, do you take that revolver apart in the initial stage?
I do not.
So later on, and I'll come back to this, but you indicated when you hit that hammer with your mallet that it fractured some internal components, correct?
Correct.
And there was the sear. We saw a little piece of the trigger. You remember, sir?
Yes.
Now, because you did not open the revolver prior to doing that hammer test, can you be certain any of those pieces weren't broken before?
No, you cannot.
I would say I can't be 100% certain. However, because it did function normally, I would expect those pieces were intact at the time I received it and did that initial examination.
So just like he said, I couldn't be 100% certain. I would also say, well, it's still possible for it to function normally, even if one of those pieces were broken. Not all of them necessarily, but it can still function properly with 1 or 2, or maybe even all of those pieces that are broken inside that we looked at, right?
Okay. And when you visually examined it from the outside, you then test fired that weapon 12 times. Is that right?
As it was 12 times throughout the process, but yes.
And you observed when you did that it had to be fully cocked and that trigger had to be depressed to fire it, correct?
Aside from the hammer being at rest and being struck on a loaded chamber.
Correct. And other than those tests you did, I'm talking about the first part, it fired normally.
Correct.
Okay. Now, after you did that normal gun functionality testing to determine its functioning, you then do what's called accidental discharge testing. Is that right?
That was after the microscopic comparisons were done. So that was the last test that I did.
Okay. So you do the functionality, then you do the microscopic examination we saw, and then you do the accidental discharge.
Correct.
Okay. Now, the accidental discharge, you mentioned that you consulted the FBI SOP.
That's correct.
An SOP is a standard operating procedure?
Yes, sir.
And there's nothing defense attorneys love better than standard operating procedures and booklets that say exactly how you're supposed to do things, because it's very rare that every single person does it right by the book. And if you can find one thing they didn't do by the book, you better believe defense attorneys are going to point that out. The Tomlet said, Anyone who uses firearms knows 12 rounds isn't much, but AB only fired once. We don't know how many times it was fired before that. Figuring out when it might have misfired is hard to calculate. I agree. Joe, Peter, you already made a guilty verdict for Baldwin. Just curious. Absolutely not. Absolutely presumed innocent. I'm just looking at what I think the state's going to present. And I think there's going to be a lot of holes because this defense attorney, like I've said already multiple times in this video, does not need to go as hard at this witness because it could cut in his client's favor if Baldwin had to pull the trigger, right? Because that's Baldwin that did something wrong. But for that, none of this would have happened. So it's kind of hard for him to toe that line. But I think Baldwin's lawyers are going to go in on this testing. Let's wish a happy B-Day to John Nizer from behind the scenes. May your birthday be filled with happiness, blessings, and plenty of cakes, John. Yes, I was going to do this at the end, but why not now? Happy birthday to John behind the scenes. The young man has finally caught up to me today.
Now, under that standard operating procedure, were you to do a type of test called a drop test?
So the drop test is, I would say that's a subcategory of accidental discharge where I physically drop the firearm to see if it will fire. And that is typically only done if that is as the situation has been reported by the contributor. So that was not relevant in this case. Okay,
when you say in a drop test, you can tell the jury more. That's when you, from a distance of about 4 feet, drop the weapon, and if it lands and it fires, that's what you're trying to determine, correct?
It depends on how the situation is being reported. So within that same SOP, it provides the examiner some discretion as in regards to how that is believed to occur. So for instance, say I'm cleaning my gun and I accidentally knock it off the table and I'm saying that caused it to fire. I would try to replicate that situation. If I had a gun leaning against a door and I'm saying that the door opened and the firearm fell, I would try to replicate that situation. So yes, the traditional drop test is just it being held as you would to shoot it and dropping it, but there is some discretion that's allowed if it is being reported in a certain way.
Okay, and you're familiar with SAMI standards, are you not?
Yes.
And SAMI.
So it's like, okay, we got SOP, we got the drop test, the SAMI standards. Defense attorneys love to throw out these like taglines or slogans or different procedures or different standards or different tests just by their names or acronyms to test and see if the expert actually knows. And if they don't, oh boy, are those defense attorneys going to get excited? Like when he didn't know what that dummy round was from Spain. He was like, yeah, you don't know about that, do you? You know about this. Let me tell you about this, right? So they love to do that. He says, yes, he's going to test him on him, but we're getting to see a good defense attorney at work. And that's what they do. They love that type of stuff. They love to talk about procedures and processes and standards and tests because it tells people exactly how they're supposed to do things. And if you do it wrong, we can always have a doubt that you got the right result.
Is the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturing Institute, is that correct?
That is correct.
They were commissioned by the federal government about 100 years ago to come up with industry type standards.
I don't know when they were instituted, but yes, they come up with standards for ammunition as far as dimensions and things like that.
1926.
And you see how he's like, say, they came out 100 years ago. And he's like, well, I don't know exactly when they were. 1926. I do. It's dangerous sometimes to out expert an expert. But when you can have a fact like that and the expert doesn't know and you show off a little in front of the jury, like the expert doesn't even know when it came out, but I do. I know when it came out. Sometimes it's effective. Sometimes it's not.
Were you aware of that?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. So in their SAMI standards, there is a standardized drop test. You're aware of that?
I'm not.
Okay. But that's the industry standard for firearms across the country. This type of testing, right? Multiple states use this?
I wouldn't say that's the industry standard. And also their industry is different from the forensic industry.
Okay.
You better believe the defense is going to have an expert that says this is the industry standard. That's always what happens. And the experts, well, I don't know if I would say that's the industry standard.
Oh, there's no type of shock test. You know what a shock test is?
In regards to what?
Well, it's kind of what you did with the mallet. Are you familiar with the National Institute of Justice? They call it a shock test.
I'm not familiar with that test.
Okay. So when you made your determination to hit that revolver with a mallet, is that part of the SOP that you hit it with a mallet?
That is written in the SOP, yes.
How many times have you done that as a forensic examiner? How many weapons you've done that on?
I would say probably less than 10. And this is the first one that I've had in actual casework.
Okay. So
he's done it in less than 10, but everything else is training. Francis brought this up earlier. And it wasn't necessarily that it's the first time he ever tested a gun, but she is right. And when she says the first time he ever tested it with the mallet, he broke it. Now, it may be unfair because this is a known risk, basically, when you're testing it like this, that you can break it. That's why it's called destructive testing. But, in the jury's mind, that may not know the whole picture. A defense says, first time this guy's ever done it, he broke the gun. How can we really trust any of his testing? Now, how much does that help Hannah Gutierrez? I'm not sure. But Alec Baldwin's attorneys, I think, are really going to go hard at that. And Bodie said, he didn't test the hammer when it was between cocking, which is kind of what Alec Baldwin said in his interview. And I bet that's something Baldwin's attorneys are going to ask. Well, what about if it's between here? What if you're going from 2 to 3 or from 3 to full or from full to resting and those types of questions, which doesn't seem like he did that, but maybe they're saving that portion of the testimony for Baldwin's trial.
Actual casework, what do you mean by that?
As opposed to training.
Oh, in training. So the other 9 were done in training when you hit it with the mallet.
I don't know the exact number, but yes.
So this is literally the first time in your career as a forensic examiner that you've ever, in cases, hit a revolver with a hammer.
That is correct.
So is it fair to say you've never had the situation where you've hit a revolver and it's broken before?
Not in a case.
Okay. Did that happen in training?
I don't know about it specifically being a revolver, but yes, I have done it in training where the firearms do break.
And you earlier told us that you base your discretion on that accidental discharge test on input given to you about what might have happened.
Not the accidental discharge test. That would be the drop test.
Drop test. So you didn't have any information this was hit with some kind of hammer on the rest set, correct?
That's correct. I did not.
Okay, but you chose to do this.
So he's saying you didn't do the drop test because you didn't have any proof that it was dropped, but you hit it with a hammer. Did anybody say it was hit with a hammer? That's kind of weird, right?
And then you hit the weapon with the hammer resting in the resting position, right?
Yes.
And then you did in the full cock position, correct?
It was not in that order, but you are correct.
Okay, and I'm not trying to mix it up, but when you hit it with the full cock position, that's when you broke the internal components.
Yes.
Now, do you know how hard you hit that?
I do not.
So on a drop test, would you agree with me? You're trying to eliminate variables. So in other words, gravity is the same, right?
Sure.
Gravity's not going to change. So if you drop that gun from 4 feet every time, and you know the weight of that gun, you're eliminating variables, correct?
I suppose so.
Okay. Well, have you been taught that at all in the FBI?
No. The purpose of these.
I like that he follows up when they're like, yeah, whatever you say. I like when he follows up with, was that not standard operating procedure or how you've been trained or what you should do? Explain to me why that's not a better variable, because everybody can drop it the same from 4 feet, 2 feet, 5 feet, whatever it may be. And then we can tell how high it is when it broke. But if you're hitting the hammer versus me versus my client, it could be very different.
This is not to figure out exactly what height or exactly what amount of force or exactly how many numbers of times you have to strike this firearm to get it to fire. It's just to try to generally replicate the situations and see if the firearm will fire without pulling the trigger.
Well, sir, so did you ever measure the trigger pull force on that revolver?
I did.
You did?
Yes.
What was the trigger pull force?
May I refer to my notes?
Yes, sir.
Between 2 and 2.5 pounds.
2.5 pounds. Okay. Did you measure the weight of that firearm?
The weight of
Of the revolver?
No.
Okay. So, and you have no idea the foot-pounds of pressure that you were applying to that hammer when you hit it with the mallet, correct?
Right. There's no way to quantify that.
And there's no way to quantify when you do that 6 times if you're hitting it the same amount every time, right?
That's correct.
As a human being, I mean, you're not going to hit it the exact same every time.
True.
I believe that's true. Yes.
Okay. So as we sit here, we don't know what amount of force was required to break that hammer and the internal parts, correct?
That's correct. We do not.
Okay. So if there was a question whether or not an external force of some type hit that hammer, we don't know from your testing what amount of force that was that would cause that.
You are correct.
Okay. If you were you given any other information regarding the accidental discharge testing that you can recall?
Initially, that test was not requested. It was not part of the initial exam. That the decision to do that test came in later conversations with the case agent.
Okay. So initially, they did not even ask you to do that, but it was sometime later they did.
Correct.
And did you have any understanding as to why you were going to do that?
I believe it had something to do with one of the individuals involved stating that the trigger was not pulled.
Was that Alec Baldwin?
I believe so.
And based on your testing on the functionality, that comment about the trigger not being pulled could not have happened.
I wouldn't say, I can't say it's impossible because I can't account for every single variable. All I can testify to is the results of my testing. Okay, so when I received the firearm and I did that initial function examination, it did not appear that any of the safeties were malfunctioning or anything like that. So it was functioning normally when I received it.
And to be fair, sir, you did indicate.
So there he's like, it's impossible I didn't pull the trigger, right? So after he kind of picked apart his testing and talked about how he hit it different ways and he doesn't know if the components are broken before they got it. So he picked apart his testimony to drag down his expertise a little bit, yet he wants to use the punchline of his expertise, which is that Alec Baldwin had to pull that trigger. Interesting. See, that's exactly what I mean by towing the line here.
You do this in a lab, so you can't account for all the variables that might occur on a movie set, for example.
Sure.
Okay. So your testimony, and you're telling the jury that you can account for the variables you're aware of, but you cannot account for variables you might not be aware of.
Sure.
Okay. And some of those variables, and we'll come to the rounds in a little bit, but some of those variables include if you do not receive evidence or request to test it, you're not going to test that.
He also goes into like, did you test for DNA? Did you test for fingerprints, things like that? And this guy's like, that's outside of my purview. And then they call this witness, who is the forensic examiner, fingerprint expert. And she tested some of the ammunition boxes in question where the rounds were mixed up. We know rounds came from Hannah Gutierrez. And basically she said that the 2 boxes she tested confirmed Hannah Gutierrez's fingerprints were on them. David Hall's fingerprints were on them. Alec Baldwin and Sarah Zachary's fingerprints were not on them. They were excluded. And on the second box, Baldwin and Zachary again were excluded. Hall's and Hannah Gutierrez were inconclusive, but basically that there probably were some kind of prints from them on the ammunition. On cross, the defense brings up a good point that she didn't even test for Seth Kenny's, who's the ammo supplier, but it seems like the state has other evidence to prove that it didn't come from his shop. And there was a mistake in the order of when it got to her, that it went to firearms first. And she kind of agreed that she should have got them to do the fingerprint testing before it went to the firearms experts to do their testing. And she was the last witness before we went to lunch today. Blue Lagoon says, why were there live rounds in the first place? The mind boggles. This is the ultimate question, in my opinion, for Hannah Gutierrez. And I do think the state's doing a good job to at least cross out everybody else. It wasn't Zachary, her supervisor, who also had the keys and also kind of controlled the ammo. It wasn't Alec Baldwin. It wasn't Kenny. Now, David Halls, I think, is still somebody that the defense could point the finger to, but how did the live rounds get on set, and how did they get through all of the procedures and protocols that should have been in place? And again, if the defendant takes the stand, she's going to get destroyed on safety protocols, standard operating procedures, and things like that. So, and that's exactly what her attorney's been doing to a lot of the other witnesses. I don't understand the point of this testing. Baldwin didn't hit the gun. I think the point was to see if you just like hit the cylinder of the gun or hit the handle of the gun, would it just go off? Is it that messed up inside that just Baldwin holding it could have caused it to go off without him doing anything? The answer to that was no, but it was a very convoluted no, because it did go off 2 times when he hit the hammer. One of them exactly how it was supposed to from the manual when it's at resting, one of them when it's fully cocked, but only because it's broken. I don't know. It is definitely more confusing than it has to be. John, off topic. Could it be a gun manufacturing default? I don't know. Companies test them and before sale to the public, but it can happen though, and has ? I don't know, like a product liability type of thing. I would think that if it was, that everybody would be pointing the company or pointing the finger at the company that made the firearm. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting to me. And I really am enjoying how the state's methodically going through, proving point by point what they need to prove, disproving the things they need to disprove that they heard in the defense's opening. I also think that the defense is doing a good job poking a lot of holes and pointing the finger in certain areas that I think it makes sense. But is the state going to cross the finish line of proving Gutierrez Reed brought the live ammo on set, or at the very least that her negligence, her failure was so obvious and so egregious that it should rise to the level of criminal involuntary manslaughter? And I do think they're methodically working there. It's supposed to last 3 weeks. It's been about a week now after today. We're going to continue to follow this case as long as people are interested. It seems like there's some mixed interest. Some people come for every video. Some people are like, I could watch something else, or it doesn't really matter. So if you are interested, let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll move it to just once a week updates if people aren't as interested. If you guys are, hit that like button to let me know, and I'll keep doing dailies at lunchtime when the court takes a break to pop in for about 45, 50 minutes and get you through a full day of witnesses like we were able to do today. But this was one of the most important witnesses, so I'm glad we were able to take our time and take a couple big chunks of his direct and cross exam and to get your questions answered. Court is probably starting back up any minute. So I appreciate you guys joining me here. Hit that like button on the way out, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Until next time, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, The Lawyer You Know.